Infinix Note 50s 5G Plus, India's slimmest phone with 144Hz 3D curved AMOLED display. Search on Flipkart.
जब मैक्स प्रोटीन बार है तो हेल्थ से चीटिंग क्यों करते हो ब्रदर?
High protein, tasty and filling, natural ingredients.
प्रोटीन स्नैकिंग मतलब नो चीटिंग.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Global stock markets are tumbling after President Trump unveiled the biggest hike in global tariffs in modern U.S. history, including a 10% blanket tariff on all imported goods from about 185 countries. In addition, many U.S. trading partners, including the European Union, China, and Japan, will see even higher tariffs. China now faces a total 54% tariff. Trump announced the plan during a speech in the Rose Garden at the White House.
My fellow Americans, this is Liberation Day, waiting for a long time. April 2nd, 2025 will forever be remembered as the day American industry was reborn, the day America's destiny was reclaimed, and the day that we began to make America wealthy again. We're going to make it wealthy, good and wealthy. For decades, our country has been looted, pillaged, raped, and plundered by nations near and far, both friend and foe alike. American steelworkers, auto workers, farmers, and skilled craftsmen, we have a lot of them here with us today. They really suffered gravely. They watched in anguish as foreign leaders have stolen our jobs, foreign cheaters have ransacked our factories, and foreign scavengers have torn apart our once beautiful American dream.
The impact of Trump's tariffs are expected to be felt around the world. While Trump claims the tariffs will boost the U.S. economy, many economists fear it could lead to a recession or worse. Trump's trade war could also shift global alliances as countries seek new trading partners. China, Japan, South Korea have already announced plans to increase trading ties and coordinate their response to Trump's tariffs. We begin today's show with Richard Wolff, professor of economics emeritus, University of Massachusetts Amherst, visiting professor in the graduate program in international affairs at the New School. He's the founder of Democracy at Work and hosts a weekly national TV radio program called Economic Update, the author of a number of books, including most recently Understanding Capitalism and the Sickness is the System, when capitalism fails to save us from pandemics or itself. Professor Wolff, it's great to have you with us again. Well, start off by responding to, and were you surprised, shocked, or do you guess that, well, about 185 countries were going to see increased or tariffs?
On the one hand, we knew something like this was coming. On the other hand, the sweep and the scope of it does make you stop. Mr. Trump is right. It is a changing moment in American history and world history. But I think his representation of what's going on is completely fantastical and has only to do with the self-promotion that he is engaged in most of the time. It was never foreigners who did it to us. This notion of the United States as a victim, we have been one of the greatest beneficiaries in the last 50 years of economic wealth, particularly for people at the top, just like him. It has nothing to do with foreigners taking advantage of us. This attempt to make himself strong and powerful relative to others, to blame the foreigner. These are cheap shots that a real president wouldn't do. And there's the most important point. The American economy is in trouble. The American empire is in decline. We don't want to discuss it in this country. We engage in denial, and instead we are striking out at other people, a sad way of handling a decline. The British Empire declined before us, so did all the others. We are now at that point. We had a great 20th century. 21st century is different. You have to face those problems. That's not being done. What's being done is to say we have difficulties, but they're all somebody else's fault, and we're going to solve it by punishing them. I would like to point out, as you suggest quite rightly, Amy, that the rest of the world is not going to sit by. The United States does not have the power it had in the 20th century. It is not in the position it seems to imagine itself. When the Secretary of the Treasury added to Mr. Trump's comments that he warned the rest of the world not to retaliate, that would imply that if they do, there would be escalation. Yes, he said, there will be escalation. Well, nothing will guarantee more escalation than if they do nothing, because then it's an invitation to Mr. Trump to keep doing it as each of these efforts doesn't work.
Given how dramatic this was yesterday, is it possible he was deciding this to the very last second as they put this off? And explain exactly. You're a professor, you're a teacher. Most people don't even realize how tariffs work.
Okay. A tariff is a tax. It's just a particular tax that got that name. It used to be called import duty. All it means is when something comes into the United States that was produced outside and is brought in to be sold, it has to pay a tax, literally as it crosses our border into our country. It is paid by the American company that brings it in, which may pass it on to the consumer, usually what happens, and the tax goes to Uncle Sam. It goes to Washington. Mr. Trump loved to suggest that tariffs were paid by the others, a little bit like Mexico would pay for the wall. Never happened. It's not going to happen here either. It's an American tax. And there's something remarkable that clues you into how big a change this is, that the Republican Party, which has branded itself as the anti-tax party for a century, is now imposing the most massive tax imaginable. Why this big change? Because we have big, big problems, and this kind of slapping the rest of the world is an attempt to solve a little bit of them, but it is not going to work because we don't have the power to do it anymore.
I want to go to UAW President Sean Fain, who supports Trump's new tariffs, saying last week, "We applaud the Trump administration for stepping up to end the free trade disaster that's devastated working class communities for decades." Fain spoke Sunday on CBS's Face the Nation.
We've seen over 90,000 manufacturing facilities leave the United States. We've seen in the big three alone in the last 20 plus years, 65 plants have closed. And so, look, tariffs aren't the total solution. Tariffs are a tool in the toolbox to get these companies to do the right thing, and the intent behind it is to bring jobs back here and invest in the American workers. If they're going to bring jobs back here, they need to be life-sustaining jobs where people can make a good wage, a living wage, have adequate health care, and have a retirement security, and not have to work 7 days a week or multiple jobs just to scrape to get by paycheck to paycheck.
Well, while UAW President Sean Fain praised Trump's tariffs, he also said he had great concerns about President Trump's move to eliminate contracts for 700,000 federal workers, the firing of workers at the National Institute of Health and other agencies.
I was a bit disappointed. I like Sean Fain, many of us do. But this was disappointing to say, basically, I will support the president because he does something that might help my union, even though Sean Fain knows, as most economists do, that if you put a tax on the goods coming in, they will go up in price because we have to pay that tax now. And that will lead to domestic producers able to raise their prices because their competitors from abroad are stuck with this tax. So we expect a boost to inflation, which is going to hurt the working class of this country in a very serious way, especially if it builds on itself. itself, which often happens when you do tariffs like this. And I want to remind everyone, including Sean Fain, that the auto workers also represent workers in places that need export markets, that produce in America and sell abroad. When those countries retaliate, as they likely will, we will lose export markets, and that will mean fewer jobs. And no one, let me stress, no one now knows whether the jobs lost from this trade war will be greater or smaller than any jobs that are gained. It is a big risk being taken by Mr. Trump, and if it doesn't go well, it'll be very bad for the American economy. It will produce the recession folks are worried about, because if the prices go up, people buy less, and that loses jobs. When you look at all of this, this is an incredibly risky effort to blame the world, punish the world, and then cross his fingers, which is what he's doing, hoping it comes out all right. Reminds me of the football metaphor. This is a Hail Mary pass. You throw it down the field. You hope it bounces into your team's hands. But that's all it is, a long shot. And it's a sign of how troubled the American economy now is.
If you can put this in the bigger picture, talk about the tax cuts and how they fit into the tariffs. What is it, something like $4 trillion in tax cuts, and who benefits? And then talk about the other issues that President Trump keeps saying that they're not going to touch, even though what many call his co-president, Elon Musk, whether he steps back from being, giving speeches or not, going after Social Security, issues like Medicaid.
Let me start with the tax issue. The biggest single thing that Trump did in his first presidency was the tax cut of December 2017. And when that tax cut was written into law, it had a sunset. It expires this year, 2025. If that expiration is allowed to happen, corporations and the rich, who were the big beneficiaries back then, will face a big tax cut. He doesn't want to do that because that's his base, that's his donor support. He doesn't want to have those taxes go back up. Well, then what is he going to have to do? If he keeps on spending and he doesn't let those taxes go back up, he's going to have to borrow trillions, as we have been doing. He doesn't want to be the president who keeps borrowing trillions, in part because the rest of the world is a major creditor of the United States, and they're not going to continue to do it the way they have. So he's in a jam. He has to do something. So his hope is to savage the expenditures in this country. Look what he's doing. Mr. Musk stands there with a chainsaw to give us the clear implication. I'm going to solve the problem on the backs of the working class. I'm firing them all. I don't care what the rest of the working class suffers. I'm going to fire all these people without notice, without plan. Calling this efficient is a silly joke. An efficient process takes time, takes experts. You're not doing that. You're just wholesale firing. Calling that efficiency is an attempt to fool people that shouldn't make any difference. Mr. Trump is now in a jam. He can't get out of this without in some way solving the problem that has been built up. And there is no way other than the one he's doing, because it's the last gasp of how to take away from the mass of the people the ability to borrow. I mean, let's be honest. If you put a tariff, you make everything coming in from abroad more expensive. That means people will buy less of it. They'll shrink their standard of living. If American companies take advantage of the tariff, which they always do by raising their prices, that will also hurt the working class. You are immiserating your workers in order to try to solve the problem you haven't solved before. But here's the irony that may in the end come back to haunt us. Europe has been unable to unify under the umbrella of American alliances. The enmity of the United States is bringing Europe together better than the alliance was able to do. And as you pointed out, very important, China, Japan, and South Korea, with long histories of animosity and tension, are getting together to cope with this. Wow, we are unifying the whole world. If you want the big picture, in my judgment, After World War II, George Kennan taught us about containment. We're going to contain the Soviet Union. The irony, which the philosopher Hegel would enjoy, we are becoming contained. We are isolating ourselves. The votes in the UN are the United States alone, or the United States and Israel and 2 or 3 other countries. The isolation politically, the isolation now economically. We are the rogue nation for the rest of the world. We may not want it, we may not agree, but it doesn't really matter if that's how they perceive us. And that's what's happening.
You talked about South Korea, Japan, and China joining together. One of the biggest announcements of tax cuts was against Taiwan. It's just a little more complicated for Taiwan to join that group.
And also another one was Vietnam, which got a very heavy whack. I mean, is there no recognition of what the United States did to that country? Maybe you wouldn't want to crush them with this kind of a thing after. As I'm saying, this is a change. This is a sign to the world that as the United States empire declines, this is a nasty place that's going to, gesture and thrash around, doing damage everywhere as it copes with its own decline.
Former Greek finance minister Yanis Varoufakis recently wrote a piece headlined Donald Trump's Economic Master Plan. He wrote, quote, "This is what his critics don't understand. They mistakenly think he thinks that his tariffs will reduce America's trade deficit on their own. He knows they won't. Their utility comes from their capacity to shock foreign central bankers into reducing domestic interest rates. Consequently, the euro, the yen, and the renminbi will soften relative to the dollar. This will cancel out the price hikes of goods imported into the U.S. and leave the prices American consumers pay unaffected. The tariff countries will be, in effect, paying for Trump's tariffs." Do you agree with that, Professor Wolf?
No, even though Yanis and I do a lot of work together, so normally I defer to him. He's wonderful in his analysis. I don't think this is correct. Is it a possible outcome? Yes. We're in a situation. Let me put it this way. Tariffs are not new. They've been around for hundreds of years. If you teach a course in international economics, which I've done, you tell students, here are 1,000 books, here are 5,000 articles. We know. And the answer is, when you impose a tariff, you don't know what the outcome is because it depends on everything else going on. Interest rates, exchange rates of currencies, rising or falling economies around the world. You can't know in advance. It's a very risky thing, which is why for the last 50 years, we have had, administered by the U.S., something called free trade or neoliberal or globalization. All of that is over now. The United States can't win anymore in that system, so it is reverting to economic nationalism. And that's a fundamental shift that throws the world. It was the accepted wisdom for 50 years, the last 50 years, not to do what Mr. Trump is doing now. If you want, you can think that everybody who thought that way for 50 years was wrong, and Mr. Trump, the genius, is correct. But that would be a long shot. Better bet he's trying to save his own political life, and he's trying to cope, to his credit, with a declining economy without having to admit that that's the case. This won't end well. It normally doesn't. And what we're going to see is the fighting against one another of the Europe bloc, the Asian bloc, the American bloc, at a time when the United States is weaker than it has been economically and politically. Look at the debacle in the Ukraine as well, the misunderstanding that the Russians could turn to the Chinese and the Indians to cope with the costs of that war in a way that hadn't been calculated and is turning out to shape the outcome. And it's not a question of which side you're on, but just watching how it lines up. That's the problem.
30 seconds. As you often talk about, are you seeing this as the beginning of the end of American empire?
Yes. I think we are already in 10, 12 years of that decline. It can't. Here's a single best statistic. If you add up the GDP, the total output of goods and services in a year for a country, of the United States and its major allies, the G7, it's about 28% of global output. If you do the same thing for China and the BRICS, It's about 35%. They're already a bigger block of economic power than we are. Every country in the world thinking about building a railroad or expanding its health program. They used to send their people to Washington or London to get help. They still do. But when they're done, they send the same team to Beijing, New Delhi, Sao Paulo, and they often get a better deal. The world is changing. And the United States could cope, but as with alcoholism, you have to admit you have a problem before you're in a position to solve it. We have a nation that does not yet want to face what this all adds up to.
Global stock markets surged on Wednesday after President Trump announced a 90-day pause on sweeping new tariffs for most countries, while at the same time escalating the U.S. trade war with China. Trump raised tariffs on China to 125% after China increased tariffs on U.S. goods to 84% following the Trump administration's initial tariff increases. China has also taken other retaliatory actions, including new restrictions on rare earth exports to the U.S. As for most of the rest of the world, a 10% tariff remains in place, but the more sweeping tariffs were paused just hours after going into effect. Global stock markets had been tumbling ever since Trump announced the new tariffs on April 2nd, on what he called Liberation Day.
The Trump administration's given conflicting accounts as to why Trump reversed course. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent said it was Trump's, quote, strategy all along. But Trump himself openly admitted he was concerned about the unraveling of the U.S. bond market.
Bond market is very tricky. I was watching it, but if you look at it now, it's beautiful. The bond market right now is beautiful. But yeah, I saw last night where people were getting a little queasy. I think everything had. Well, the big move wasn't what I did today. The big move was what I did on Liberation Day.
On Wednesday, the S&P 500 soared 9.5% and the Nasdaq jumped over 12% after Trump made his announcements about the tariff pause in a post on Truth Social just before 1:30 p.m. Earlier in the day, Trump wrote, quote, "This is a great time to buy, DJT." Democratic Senator Adam Schiff is now calling on Congress to determine whether the Trump administration engaged in insider trading or market manipulation. Bloomberg is reporting the world's richest people added $304 billion to their combined net worth on Wednesday, the largest one-day gain in the history of the Bloomberg Billionaires Index.
We're joined now by two guests. From Rome, Italy, Nancy Chen is with us. She's a professor of economics at Northwestern University, co-director of Northwestern University's Global Poverty Research Lab, founding director of the China Econ Lab. Her latest piece for Project Syndicate is headlined, "Americans Can't Win from Trump's Trade War." Joseph Stiglitz is with us in studio here in New York, Nobel Prize-winning economist, Columbia University professor, former chair of the Council of Economic Advisors. Professor Stiglitz is also currently the chief economist of the Roosevelt Institute. His latest book, The Road to Freedom, Economics and the Good Society. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Professor Stiglitz, let's begin with you. Just overall respond to this roller coaster. And if anyone has any doubt that global outcry matters and protests around the globe make a difference, like what happened this weekend, well, just take a look at what happened yesterday. Can you talk about, Professor Stiglitz, your response?
There's been total chaos. And one of the things that we know is that chaos is bad for the market. But there's been already lasting damage. You know, for the last 80 years, we were trying to create a world where a borderless world, at least borders matter less. All of a sudden, borders matter more. And it's not only borders with those you don't like, it's borders with our best friends in Canada. So this is a new world where every country has to ask a question that we never asked before. What is the extent of our national economic sovereignty? What will happen if some crazy person in another country, in the United States, for instance, would suddenly raise tariffs 20%, 10%, 20%, 50%, 100%. So there is no reliability in our relationships, whether with friend or not so friend. What is also clear is that Trump has no economic theory behind what he's doing. And I think that's most disturbing, both to me as an economist and to those who are on the other side of negotiations. I've talked to some of these people and they say, we don't know how to negotiate because the other side is not a normal negotiator. Normally the other side knows what they want. There's a theory about how trade works. That's not true here. It's a different world. So let me give you an example. Trump thinks that trade deficits by themselves, and in particular trade deficits in goods, reflect somebody treating us unfairly. And it's based sort of on a premise that we are better than any other country, so people should be buying more goods from us than we are buying from them. It's absurd. The net magnitude of the multilateral trade deficit is just determined by the disparity between aggregate savings on the one hand, and national savings and aggregate national demand, investment on the other. And if savings goes down, then we'll have a bigger deficit. Now, his proposal to have a big tax cut, unfunded, is effectively a lowering of national savings. And that's going to make the multilateral national trade deficit larger. Mm. Then you look at the microeconomics. I just want to mention, he makes a big difference between goods and services. But we are in the 21st century, not where we were in 1950. Services are the major part of our economy. Goods production, manufacturing is 9-10%. What are important? Service sector, tourism, education, health. What is he doing to those sectors? Look what he's done in the last few weeks. He's devastated our education system. The way his border immigration people have treated those wanting to come into our country with valid passports, visas, has discouraged tourism. So he is hell-bent at hurting America's major export industry, tourism, and education. So he's making things just that much more worse at the micro level and at the macro level.
So before I bring in Professor Nancy Chan, I wanted to ask you, you just said earlier that chaos is bad for the market, indisputable, but how do you explain, people are absolutely perplexed, we had that in the introduction as well, how is it that just as Trump declared a pause on these tariffs, the market soared? And not just soared, I mean, for the biggest daily gain since 2008, the S&P. What explains that?
But remember that the market had gone down enormously, almost into bear territory in the two preceding days. Yeah. There is a lot of irrational exuberance at times in the market. My judgment is that they've made a mistake. And the reason I think there's a mistake is the importance of trade with China in many ways is much larger than trade with Europe. That we depend enormously for goods coming from China. We buy cars from Europe. If we don't have the European cars, we suffer a little bit, but it's not a big deal. If we don't have the ingredients that go into so many of our goods, or if those ingredients go up twice in price, that's a big disturbance. Mm-hmm. So I'm anticipating that there will be actually a very big disturbance from these enormous, unprecedented, let me emphasize, unprecedented tariffs against China, and China's retaliation, including their restrictions on exports of minerals and rare earths that we need for our production.
Mhm. So, Professor Nancy Chan, if we could get you to respond to the scale of these tariffs and what you think the impact on the Chinese economy and also the U.S. economy will be on these 125% that the U.S. has imposed on China and 84% that China has imposed on the U.S.
Like Professor Stiglitz said, these tariff rates are unprecedented. They are so high, it's really difficult for us to calibrate exactly what the cost will be on everyone, except that we know it's going to be enormous. You know, already we're seeing contracts that are being canceled between Chinese suppliers and American importers. Business relationships that took decades to build are now being paused because these tariffs are so high that no one can be profitable, can stay in business and continue to import. And, you know, the thing about tariff rates is if you increase it a little bit, then maybe people can take the hit. By people, I mean, you know, the firms, the exporters and the importers. But if you increase it a lot and they can't meet their bottom line, then they just have to stop. And we've just never seen anything like this before. And what does it mean for the US if we can't get parts from China? And also, what does it mean for China if they have to shut factories that are supporting families, you know, and children that were relying on these export jobs? So I think the cost for both economies is going to be colossal. We'll see a little bit of it in the short run. And if this continues, we're just going to see it exponentiate over time.
Let me ask you, Professor Chen, about the Treasury Secretary Bessent's comments when he said, you know, this was all planned. The question is, of course, was insider trading planned? Trump boasted yesterday the greatest increase in the stock market that the country had ever seen. And of course, the question is how these billionaires and perhaps, I can't say this, I know this, I don't know this, that Trump himself benefited yesterday as it rose, buying early. But Bessent's comment, you might even say Trump goaded China and they showed themselves to be the bad actor that they are. Your comment, Professor Chen. I think we just lost Professor Chen in Rome, Italy. So we'll put that question to Professor Stiglitz.
Well, I don't think they anticipated this kind of response. The kind of language they used was a schoolyard bully. It was, they didn't show us respect. And of course, China's view was U.S. broke international economic law. We have an international framework, the WTO, that is supposed to determine how countries determine trade policy. And we just threw that whole agreement that we played a key role in writing, we threw it in the dustpan. So the argument that, oh, he didn't show me respect is the kind of language you hear from bullies. I don't think we expected them to act so responsibly. I was in China about 2 weeks ago, and it was very clear that they were ready for another round because they had seen how erratic Trump was. And there is a fundamental asymmetry that I think Trump and his team doesn't fully grasp. The asymmetry is that China will experience a deficiency in aggregate demand as they lose their exports. You can shift that demand to producing domestically. And they've been trying to do that for a number of years. And this is going to move much harder to shift supply. So we are in a tighter bind, I think, than China.
So Professor Chen is back with us. Professor Chen, that comment of the Treasury Secretary that this was all planned and that Trump successfully managed to goad China so that they would show themselves to be the bad actors that they are. And Vance's comment the day before referring to the Chinese peasants.
It's really hard to believe that all of this was planned as a strategy to get to China, for a bunch of different reasons. One is, the unique adversarial relationship between China and the US is well known, and it's been going on since the first trade war. So there's really no new information to be learned. The second is that the Chinese and the US had actually been negotiating, and the Chinese had shown themselves to be really willing to negotiate and really not desiring a trade war. So you see that, for example, in the negotiations over the TikTok deal. So under the Biden administration, it was TikTok was asked to divorce itself from its Chinese owners, ByteDance. At the time, the Chinese government said, no way, we'll never let ByteDance sell TikTok to Americans. But then under the Trump administration, what we saw was that, the negotiations proceeded quite rapidly. And 2 days before it became official, that's when the US hiked up tariffs on China to another 34%. So that just doesn't feel like a well-planned strategy. Another way to ask it is to say, well, what has the US government achieved now that it couldn't have achieved without raising tariffs for the entire world, right? What did it achieve by increasing tariffs for islands with only penguins on it? What was the point of that? Did that tell anyone anything about American strength or about China? And the answer has to be no.
There's that cartoon going around. First, they came for the cats. Then they came for the penguins. They're mean.
I wanted to ask about the broader implications of what it would mean for a massive cut in trade between the U.S. and China. The World Trade Organization said Wednesday that this escalating tariff war could cut trade in goods between the two countries by 80%, and trade between China and the U.S. accounts for 3% of global trade, all global trade. So what would that mean? What are the fallout effects of that on other countries, much smaller economies? And Professor Stiglitz, this point that you made about the U.S. having broken international economic law, Bernie Sanders issued a statement yesterday saying that what he's done is actually unconstitutional, that Trump does not have the authority to impose the tariffs that he has. So if you could comment on both those things.
So let me begin by first emphasizing there's going to be a big economic effect on the United States, because the time it takes to bring manufacturing back in the United States, even if he were successful, is not 3 months, not even a year, 2 years. I've talked to firms that have thought about bringing manufacturing back to the United States. They say, we don't have the logistics, we don't have the supply chains that you need to bring complex manufacturing back. And modern manufacturing is robotic. So even if we brought manufacturing back, there aren't going to be many jobs. So the reality is that his picture of bringing us back to the 1950s, that's never going to happen. But what's going to happen in the meanwhile? We're not going to be able to get those goods that Americans want. We saw what happened when the supply chains got interrupted after the pandemic and after the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Prices soared, some goods more than others. And that's the world we're going to be back in. That's going to affect, of course, not only the United States, but every other country. If the Fed acts like it normally does, when prices go up, it raises interest rates. We're going to go back into stagflation.
Who is Trump's ear? I mean, you've got the trade whisperer, Peter Navarro, right, who was, top economic trade guy in the first administration, then went to prison, is now out, and continually cites the economist Ron Vero for why it's important to trade, to impose tariffs. And it turns out that Ron Vero is just an anagram of Navarro. He doesn't even exist. You can't make this stuff up. But now, of course, Donald Trump would call reporters for years as John Barron. So it's very similar. Also a fictional person. In fact, it was Donald Trump. So who is advising him? And what about the fact that people like Elon Musk joined with the oligarchy of the other billionaires against what he was doing, attacked Navarro nonstop, calling him a moron and a sack of bricks, but said that was an insult to bricks?
Well, I mean, there is no one that he seems to be listening to. In many ways, Trump is giving protectionism a bad name. There is an argument that you can say that carefully constructed policies can help build particular industries.
So UAW President Sean Fain makes that argument.
Yeah, in particular industries, it has to be crafted. More important for developing countries than developed. We don't need that as much as a poor developing country, but sometimes you can use carefully crafted trade policies to do that. But his broad-based policies, his going after Canada, his going after the penguins, makes absolutely no sense. And what he's bringing back is the concern that we've had, that political economists have had for a very long time. It can be a source of corruption. When you negotiate in a non-transparent way, what happens is bribes get paid. You say, take off my tariff and I'll give you money. Money either directly to you or to your campaign coffers. So we're going back into a non-transparent world where, for instance, the billionaire tech bros can help shape global tech policy in international trade to the detriment of the entire world. He's already done that. He's made a big deal about the EU changing its laws that try to create competition in the tech sphere to try to make sure that there's AI safety and social media safety, content moderation. He's attacked these fundamental laws, and all this is going to be going on in secret and with a lot of dirty stuff.
And just boasts like he did the other night. I've got all these countries kissing my, I wouldn't say it, but it rhymes with grass. I mean,
Okay. And just before we conclude, Professor Chan, if you could give us an idea, what is happening in China? What are you hearing about how industries there are preparing for what's to come?
So China, the voices in China are surprisingly calm. You know, the government's trying to strike a balance between preparing the people for economic pains to come and getting people into a mindset of solidarity. You know, they're blaming these tariff hikes on the Trump administration and the US government. And people find that convincing in this case. At the same time, they're also trying to not stir up too much nationalism. So they've been really careful to actually censor how high the tariff hikes have been by the US. They've been careful. And, you know, my reading of what's going on is that they're creating space so that they can get out of this, right? So that there's a face-saving way to negotiate and get out of this trade war if an opportunity presents itself. And, you know, in the meantime, of course, the central bankers, the industries, everyone is lining themselves up for a deep and long trade war.
this is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
The U.S. and Iran are planning to hold talks this weekend in Oman. President Trump made the announcement on Monday. He said direct talks will be held, while Iran said they would be indirect talks. Presidential envoy Steve Witkoff will head the U.S. delegation. Iran is sending its foreign minister Abbas Araghchi. In 2018, Trump withdrew the United States from the landmark Iran nuclear deal, the JCPOA, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action. On Monday, Trump directly threatened Iran when he was asked what will happen if a new nuclear deal is not reached.
If diplomacy fails, is the United States, under your leadership, ready to take military action to destroy the Iranian nuclear program and remove this threat?
I think if the talks aren't successful with Iran, I think Iran's going to be in great danger, and I hate to say it, great danger, because they can't have a nuclear weapon.
So is that a yes?
You know, it's not a complicated formula. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. That's all there is.
President Trump was sitting in the Oval Office on Monday with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu when he said that. Trump said Israel yesterday. He said Israel would take a leading role if the U.S. went ahead with striking Iran.
With Iran, if it requires military, we're going to have military. Israel will obviously be very much involved in that. He'll be the leader of that. But nobody leads us. We do what we want to do.
The Trump administration's also levied new sanctions against Iran, targeting its uranium enrichment program. We're joined right now by Nagar Mortazeh, the Iranian-American journalist, host of the Iran podcast, senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. Nagar, welcome back to Democracy Now!
Thanks for having me.
If you could start off by responding to what President Trump is threatening and what you know of these talks taking place in Oman on Saturday.
Sure. So, Amy, it seems like President Trump is kind of using his usual and specifically first-term playbook of what they have themselves coined peace through strength, or trying to get to the negotiating table or to diplomacy via threats, which in this case is military threats. We saw him do the same in his first term against Iran, with North Korea, with other parties that he wants to get to the negotiating table and feels like the other side doesn't come to the table. And so with threats and with pressure, he thinks he can force them. I think, though, the experience of the first Trump term, when it was maximum pressure on the other side, didn't really work with the Iranians and backfired. And there may have been some lessons learned. We see that he's fired some of the main figures of the maximum pressure Iran campaign, Mike Pompeo, John Bolton, Brian Hook. They're no longer with him. He's publicly disassociated with them. And so it seems like this time, his really intent on diplomacy, on a deal with Iran, on a deal that he's been trying to say is going to be a better deal, that the Obama era deal was a bad one, and his is going to be better. And potentially, I guess, a Nobel Peace Prize is something that he has his eyes on if he can get this nuclear deal with Iran, which he's called a nuclear peace deal. But at the same time, we've seen that it's difficult for him to get to the negotiating table with the Iranians. And so the pressure and these threats are also coming with it parallel. So it's a strange methodology to try to convince the other side with threats and pressure. And that's one of the reasons the Iranians are not willing to sit down directly and negotiate directly. And this emphasis on indirect negotiations is because they're also saying, look, you want to negotiate and have diplomacy, which is something Tehran has indicated they want as well. But at the same time, you're increasing maximum pressure. Just yesterday, as you said, Amy, they put on more sanctions on Iran. Since he came into office, he signed a memorandum of maximum pressure to tighten sanctions and pressure on Iran. And there have been periodic sanctions imposed on the Iranians. So it's not exactly the best way to get to the negotiating table, but nevertheless, this is his style. And the Iranians have played ball to meet with them on Saturday in Oman. But that's one of the main reasons it's going to be indirect, because the Iranian side is basically signaling that they want to see some goodwill. They also want to understand the framework and the U.S.'s bottom line of what it is that they want. Because if you listen to President Trump and, for example, Steve Witkoff, the structure or the framework they've talked about is Iran not having nuclear weapons, just not having nuclear weapons, which is something Tehran has agreed to before, and they've actually said they don't want nuclear weapons. But if you listen, for example, to National Security Advisor Michael Waltz, or Benjamin Netanyahu going out of the White House and some other people in that orbit, they're saying an entire dismantlement of Iran's nuclear program. Basically, Iran can't have a nuclear program, period. So which is it? I think that is also going to sort of show the way on Saturday to the Iranians.
So Nigar, also, if you could talk about what the situation is, the economic context in which these negotiations are taking place in Iran, the enormous economic pressure that's been brought to bear on Iran over all these years of sanctions now exponentially multiplied, and the fact that in an unprecedented move, the Iranian president Masoud Pezeshkian has said that if a deal is reached, American companies could come and invest in Iran.
Sure. So let me start with the latest. The Iranian president, again, exactly as you said, unprecedented, has said that the supreme leader himself is open to American companies coming to Iran and investing. And this is, again, signal to President Trump, because his criticism, one of his main criticism of the JCPOA, President Obama's legacy nuclear deal with Iran, was that the Europeans were reaping all the benefits and not Americans. And this is mainly, it's not something that Iran has started. It's something that American companies can't do because of very strict US sanctions. American companies can't have trade with Iran or any form of investment because of the punishment that the US government will impose on them in the form of sanctions. In fact, secondary sanctions now have prevented other companies around the world, Europeans, Asians, many others, to these sanctions if they do trade with Iran. So if that's something that President Trump wants, he can change that. Iran had a deal to buy airplanes, passenger airplanes from Boeing, and even that was stopped from happening, which essentially Boeing took an economic hit for that. As far as the economic situation in Iran, well, the economy is in pretty bad shape, declining as a direct result of these harsh economic sanctions. Iran is one of the most, if not the most, one of the most sanctioned countries in the world right now by the US. As I said, these primary and secondary sanctions, which even punish non-American companies who do trade with Iran if you buy Iranian oil, gas. As a result of that, Iran has a lot of its assets sitting in reserves, basically blocked outside the country. For example, the Iraqis buy a lot of energy from Iran, but they owe the money in billions to Iran because the US doesn't allow them to pay Iran back. And so it's a combination of this cutoff, Iran's being cut off from the world economy, or most of it, that has really impacted the state of affairs and the living situation for ordinary Iranians, working class, middle class Iranians. The life, basically, their
we have 30
purchasing
seconds.
power has shrinked.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
There's a nip in the air. It's the chill of fear and despair that is all too familiar to me. The recent Columbia graduate student Mahmoud Khalil's detention by Immigration and Customs Enforcement on Saturday has brought back my most tormenting childhood nightmares as a child of Holocaust survivors in communist Romania in the 1950s. Those are the words of our next guest, Mariana Hirsch, Professor Emerita at Columbia University. In her recent article headlined, "I Grew Up Under a Terrifying Authoritarian Regime, Mahmoud Khalil's Arrest is Right Out of Their Playbook." The article was published in the Jewish newspaper, The Forward.
Mariana Hirsch joins us today in studio. She's the author of several books, including The Generation of Post-Memory, Writing in Visual Culture After the Holocaust. Professor Hirsch, welcome to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. You said the conditions for Mahmoud Khalil's arrest were created by Columbia, and then put that into the larger context, you having come out of authoritarian Romania.
Well, I grew up in Romania until the age of 12. My parents were survivors of the Romanian Holocaust. And when Mahmoud Khalil was abducted, when Rumesa Öztürk was abducted, and I watched those videos, it brought back these feelings of terror that I grew up with as a child, the helplessness in front of seemingly all-powerful forces that couldn't be stopped, that were arbitrary, and that had only the barest rationale for, or no rationale for, these arrests. I think the condition for these arrests have been created by our universities. Unfortunately, Columbia, where I teach and where I've taught for 20 years, was the model for this. And the way they've been created is, first of all, by accepting and then promoting the big lie that anti-Semitism is driving protests against the brutal genocidal war in Gaza, of Israel on Gaza, that these are anti-Semitic protests of excluding and suspending student groups, of draconian measures of punishment, but also of casting protesters as terrorists, which is now expanding. And what I'm seeing is spread is the kind of helplessness that I felt as a child and that I picked up from my surroundings, the fear of speaking, the suspicion that one can be denounced, that there are lists out there, that we don't know who's on the lists, that there's nothing that can be done to help. And I'm seeing my students silence themselves, being afraid to speak, wondering who might be denouncing them, who might be making lists. And let's be real. I mean, Mahmoud Khalil was chosen by Columbia to be a mediator between the administration and the student protesters. And then he was denounced by, unfortunately, I have to say, people at Columbia. There's an Intercept report that I'm sure you're aware of, that there's a group of parents, alumni, and even some faculty who are making lists of students who could be deported or who are aliens, enemies of the state, of the university. And this idea of denunciation is something that I've carried from my childhood, because my father would often come home saying that he was asked by his superiors at work whether he would name the names of people who, whatever. I mean, there was always a reason for this, and how he refused, and how, he gave up some possibilities of advancement by refusing to name those names. So this is something I was carrying. But there is a difference. We have laws. This is illegal, and there are possibilities of appeal. And there are also ways in which this narrative, this big lie of rampant anti-Semitism that universities have accepted and even promoted by forming task forces on anti-Semitism. I think there are people who are now seeing, Jerry Nadler is a great example, that this might not have been such a good idea, because it's brought upon us this terrible repression under the guise of fighting anti-Semitism. And I think people are now saying that this is not just morally completely wrong and corrupt, but that it's also not good for Jews, certainly, but it's not good for anybody, and that the reason for this was never to fight anti-Semitism, but it was to decimate academia.
And if you could talk, you've also written a piece on the extent to which and the speed with which Colombia completely capitulated or submitted to the Trump administration's demands. You wrote a piece headlined, "There's a bleak historical explanation for why Colombia's capitulation to Trump is so concerning," in which you write, quote, "We are not living in early Nazi Germany, but although as a student of fascism and the Holocaust, I've learned to be careful with such comparisons. Some resonances are too obvious to ignore." What are those resonances?
Well, the resonances are that autocratic regimes go after education. I mean, certainly higher education. Why? Well, academic freedom, self-governance, inquiry, open inquiry, the possibility that we might promote a narrative of history that is true, but that doesn't conform to the vision of the autocrat. All of those things are extremely threatening. And we've seen it not just in early Nazi Germany, but certainly in Hungary, in Turkey, in India, the crackdown on universities. But what's more concerning to me is the response of universities and how they've not just anticipatory obedience, but really anticipatory capitulation, first through these task forces and accepting the anti-Semitism narrative, but then agreeing to the demands, which are completely illegal and unreasonable demands, in the hope of pacifying the autocrat, which I think everybody already should know that is not how you can deal. So what I'm not seeing is solidarity among universities, the willingness or the eagerness to fight back and to say, no way, we're not going to stand for this.
And finally, Mariani, you've worked on the transmission of memories of violence across generations, what you call post-memory. How do you see that? You've expressed concerns, in particular, Mahmoud Khalil's unborn child, the children of Gaza. How do you see this kind of being acted out now and in the future, all the violence that we see happening now? And also, I should mention the hundreds of student visas that we know of international students that have been revoked.
Well, this revocation, just to start with that, completely arbitrary, and students are not even informed, and the university is not informed. They find out through the online system, and then the ostracism of these students, which is what happened to me as a child, and certainly to my parents, of being denationalized, of being ostracized and publicly shamed for, as a child, I was a pioneer with the red scarf, and I saw some of my classmates their red scarves were forcibly removed in front of the entire school when their parents applied for visas to leave, the country. So that's, something I carry as a child. But I'm also carrying what I call post-memory, which is memories of violence across generations that I inherited from my parents' stories. These are vicarious, but they feel like memories. And that's why I thought I needed a term for these very powerful fears and terrors that children, that we inherit for experiences that we didn't ourselves live, but that we feel like we remembered. So I guess the fear right now is that it's not only the children right now, but it's it's the future generations how they will receive this moment of fear that is spreading across the country, with people losing visas, losing status, even the stories of green card holders, but citizens possibly, and naturalized citizens like me, possibly being denationalized and like you. So I think the reverberations of this
20 seconds.
Could reach future generations, and what we're transmitting is extremely concerning to me, and I hope we're transmitting resistance, resilience, and refusal.
This is CBN Newswatch.
Thank you so much for joining us for CBN Newswatch. I'm Ephraim Graham. We begin this busy Monday in Rome, where Pope Francis died today at the Vatican after suffering with a long-term battle with double pneumonia. The faithful will remember him as someone who charmed the world with his humble style and concern for the poor. Adele Hurd is on the story.
Carissimi fratelli et sorelle.
In Rome, Vatican officials announced that at 7:35 this morning, the Bishop of Rome, Francis, returned to the house of the Father. He was 88 years old. His death came after weeks in the hospital with pneumonia, and one day after returning to the Vatican to deliver his Easter message, and to also meet Vice President J.D. Vance. But at Mass, he struggled to wish everyone a happy Easter. And then a Vatican official read his message for him. Born in Buenos Aires, the former janitor and nightclub bouncer Jorge Mario Bergoglio was the first pope from the Americas, the first from the Jesuit order, and the first to take the name Francis. He was also the first to become pope after his predecessor Benedict resigned. In 2013, Benedict declared he would be the first pontiff in 600 years to leave the throne of St. Peter alive. His name paid homage to Francis of Assisi, dedicating himself to the less fortunate, washing the feet of prisoners, and showing his desire to be close to the people, often opting to ride in an open-air car instead of the bulletproof Pope-mobile, and regularly stepping out to shake hands or to give someone a hug.
Some of the other big areas of